I dropped the glass. That's what I remember most. Not the pain, not the cold tile against my cheek, not the sound my knee made when it hit the bottom step. I remember the glass of water slipping from my hand and shattering across the hallway floor. And then I remember my son's voice from somewhere above me saying, "Dad, can you try not to make such a mess?" And then I heard laughter. Not just his. All of them. I lay there for a moment. 63 years old, face down on the floor of a house I had quietly helped pay for. And not one person moved toward me. Not my son. Not my daughter-in-law. Not her parents, who were seated in the living room with their wine glasses and their opinions about people like me. I pressed my palm against the floor and pushed myself up slowly. And when I finally stood and turned around, my son Marcus was already walking back toward the living room, smoothing his shirt, murmuring something to his father-in-law that made the old man chuckle. Nobody asked if I was hurt. Nobody looked back. I stood in that hallway for a long time, long enough to hear the ice in someone's drink settle, long enough to understand something I had been refusing to understand for almost 3 years. Then I walked to the guest bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub, and made a phone call. Let me tell you about my son. Marcus came into the world on a Tuesday morning in October, and I was the first person to hold him. His mother, Carol, was exhausted and half asleep, and the nurse placed him in my arms, and I stood there in that hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, and I thought, everything I do from this moment forward is for him. That is not a small thing to promise. Most people never say it out loud. I said it out loud, right there, to a baby who couldn't understand a word. I meant every syllable. Carol passed away when Marcus was 19. Breast cancer, diagnosed late, gone in 14 months. I will not spend time on that part of the story because some grief is not meant to be performed for anyone. What I will say is that after she died, it was just the two of us, and I made that promise again. Everything I do is for him. I had built a logistics consulting firm over 22 years. Not glamorous work. Supply chain auditing, freight analysis, contract negotiations for mid-size manufacturers who didn't have the budget for a full operations team. Unglamorous, careful, methodical work, exactly the kind of work I was good at. By the time Marcus turned 25, the firm had 3 full-time employees and pulled in just under $4 million a year in consulting fees. By the time he turned 30, I had sold a minority stake to a private equity group, restructured my own compensation, and moved most of my liquid assets into a holding company registered in Delaware, under a name that had nothing to do with my name. I want to be clear about why I did that. It was not because I was ashamed of what I had. It was because Carol always said the most dangerous thing you can give a child is the knowledge that they don't have to try. She said it when Marcus was 12, when I wanted to buy him the expensive bicycle all his friends had. She said it when he was 17, and I wanted to just write the check for his first car. She said it every time my instinct was to make his life easier than mine had been. She wasn't wrong. She was almost never wrong, so I kept things quiet. I drove a 2017 Chevy Tahoe. I lived in the same 4-bedroom house in Westerville I had bought in 2003. I wore the same type of clothes I had always worn, nothing remarkable. When Marcus asked about money, I told him I did well enough, that I had a good pension from the consulting years, that I wasn't worried. He seemed to accept that. He was not a suspicious child. Later, I would understand that lack of suspicion differently than I did at the time. I paid for Marcus's college in full. He graduated with a business degree from Ohio State. No debt. A clean start. He moved to Chicago for work, met Vanessa at some fundraiser for an arts nonprofit, and called me 8 months later to tell me he was in love. I flew out to meet her. She was polished and pretty, and said all the right things at dinner, and she had the particular quality of someone who had grown up being told they were exceptional, that flat certainty behind the eyes that comes from never having genuinely struggled. I noticed it. I filed it away. I told myself it wasn't fair to judge someone on one dinner. I told myself Marcus was happy. They got engaged 14 months later. I paid for the rehearsal dinner. I paid for the honeymoon, though they didn't know that I transferred the money quietly into Marcus's account and told him it was a gift from a college fund his mother had set up, which was close enough to true that I didn't lose sleep over it. I wanted them to have a good start. Everything I do is for him. Vanessa's family was from the North Shore of Chicago. Her father, Gerald, ran an investment firm that had once been significant and was now, as far as I could tell, surviving mostly on the reputation of what it used to be. Her mother, Patricia, was on the boards of 3 nonprofits and had strong opinions about wine and interior design and the kind of people who were worth knowing. The first time I met them, at an engagement dinner at a restaurant I later learned cost $400 a plate. Gerald shook my hand and asked what I did. I told him I was semi-retired, had been in logistics consulting. He nodded in the way that people nod when they are deciding you are not worth their full attention. Patricia asked if I had been to Tuscany. I told her I had not. She smiled and looked past my shoulder. I drove back to the hotel that night and called my attorney, a woman named Diane who had been handling my business affairs for 11 years. I told her what I had observed. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciate most about Diane. When I finished, she said, "Robert, you don't have to explain yourself to people like that." I told her I wasn't trying to explain myself. I was trying to decide something. She asked what I was deciding. I said I'd let her know. I kept paying. That is the honest version of the story. Marcus and Vanessa bought a condo in Lincoln Park. A beautiful place. 2 bedrooms, exposed brick, the kind of apartment that costs more than my first house. And I quietly covered 30% of the down payment through a gift that moved through a family trust Diane had set up. Marcus knew I had helped. He thanked me once, briefly, and then didn't mention it again. Vanessa did not thank me at all. I don't think she knew the help had come from me. I think she assumed it was a wedding gift from some relative, absorbed into the noise of starting a life. Then came the grandchild. My grandson Oliver was born on a March morning, 3 years into the marriage. I drove to Chicago the same day Marcus called me. I sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. When they finally let me in, I held that baby the same way I had held Marcus 34 years before, and I made the same promise. Everything I do is for you. I was not embarrassed to say it twice. Love that needs to apologize for repeating itself is not worth much. I started a college fund for Oliver that month. $50,000 invested conservatively in a custodial account with Diane listed as trustee. I set up a monthly transfer. I did not tell Marcus about it because I wanted it to be Oliver's, not something Marcus could factor into his financial planning. That distinction mattered to me. It still matters. Things changed when Oliver turned 2. I started noticing things I had not noticed before, or perhaps things I had noticed but chosen not to examine. Marcus would call me less frequently, and when he did call, the conversations had a particular quality, like he was checking something off a list rather than talking to his father. Vanessa stopped being at home when I visited. There was always something, a lunch, a board meeting, a thing at Oliver's daycare that only she could handle. Gerald and Patricia's names came up more often in conversation, and always in a context that suggested they were the people whose opinions organized Marcus's world. Gerald thought the new Tesla model was overrated. Patricia had recommended a new financial advisor. Gerald said the market was going to shift in Q3. I asked Marcus once, carefully, whether everything was all right. He told me everything was fine, that he was just busy with work. I asked if he was happy. He said, of course. What kind of question was that? I said the kind a father asks. He laughed and changed the subject. That Christmas, they invited me to their place for the holiday. It was the first time I had been invited for an extended stay rather than just a quick visit. I was glad. I packed a bag, wrapped presents for Oliver and Marcus, and even a scarf for Vanessa that I had asked Diane's assistant to help me pick out, and I drove to Chicago. Gerald and Patricia were already there when I arrived. They were staying in the guest room. I was shown to the fold-out couch in Marcus's home office. The office was at the back of the apartment, away from the kitchen and the living room, and it had one small window that faced the alley. I didn't say anything. I put my bag down and went to find Oliver. The first 2 days were manageable. Oliver was delighted to see me. He was 2.5 years old and had recently learned that I would make silly faces on demand, and he found this endlessly entertaining. I sat on the floor and played with his trains and pushed his toy trucks and read him the same book 4 times in a row because he kept bringing it back. Gerald and Patricia were polite in the way that people are polite when they are waiting for something to be over. Marcus was somewhere between them, more present with his in-laws than with me, laughing more easily at Gerald's jokes, touching Vanessa's shoulder in the particular way of a man who wants to be seen approving of his wife by her parents. I kept noticing. Christmas Eve dinner was a formal thing, more formal than I had expected. Vanessa had set the dining table with cloth napkins and candles, and there were 2 bottles of wine that Gerald had brought, and the food was catered from somewhere and reheated, and everyone dressed up. I wore the blazer I had brought, which was perfectly decent. Patricia commented on Gerald's tie. Nobody commented on my blazer. We sat down, Gerald at one end, Patricia beside him, Marcus and Vanessa together on one side, Oliver in his high chair at the corner, which left me at the far end of the table, not across from Marcus, not beside him, but at the opposite end, separated from my son by the length of the table and by something else I was still trying to name. Gerald opened the first bottle of wine and poured for Patricia, then Vanessa, then Marcus, then himself. He set the bottle back down. I sat with an empty glass. Marcus noticed and reached for the bottle, but Vanessa put her hand on his arm and said something quietly, and he withdrew his hand. Gerald refilled his own glass instead. I am not a man who needs someone to pour his wine for him. I reached for the bottle and poured my own glass. And when I did, Gerald watched me with an expression I recognized from boardrooms, the expression of a man who believes basic courtesy is only owed to people who have earned it. Dinner conversation moved around me. Marcus and Gerald talked about some investment opportunity, something about a commercial property on the near north side. Patricia told Vanessa about a woman from her book club whose daughter had just gotten into Northwestern law. Oliver threw a piece of roll on the floor and laughed at himself. I cut my food and listened and thought about Carol, the way I still do in rooms where I feel alone. Then Gerald said it. He had been talking about a real estate deal, a development project, something that required significant upfront capital, and Marcus was nodding along. And then Gerald said, "The thing is, we need someone to co-sign on the commercial note. A guarantor with clean credit and enough asset value to satisfy the bank." He was looking at Marcus when he said it, but then he turned his head and looked directly at me. And he said, "Marcus tells me you own your home outright and have quite a bit in savings. For a man in your position," I set my fork down. He kept talking. "It would be purely a formality. The deal is solid. We just need the paperwork to reflect a broader asset base. It wouldn't cost you anything, Robert. Your name on a document, that's all." I looked at Marcus. My son was looking at his plate. I said, "When did you discuss this with Marcus?" Gerald smiled. "We've been talking about it for a few weeks. Marcus thought you'd want to help out. Family, supporting family." He said the word family the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. I looked at Marcus again. He still had not looked up. "Marcus," I said. He raised his eyes, and I saw something there that I had not seen before. Not embarrassment, not guilt, but a kind of impatience. Like a person being interrupted during a task they've already decided to complete. "It's a good deal, Dad," he said. "Gerald knows what he's doing. You'd just be a signatory." "A guarantor," I said. "Not a signatory. That's a legal distinction." Patricia made a soft noise. Vanessa picked up her wine glass. Gerald waited with the patience of a man who expected the lesser party to eventually come around. And then Marcus said it. "Dad, please don't turn this into a whole thing. Gerald and Patricia are our family now. We're just asking you to help. Gerald and Patricia are our family now." I heard that sentence the way you hear a car accident all at once. No preparation, no cushion. Gerald made a remark about fathers and generosity that got a small laugh from Patricia. Vanessa murmured something approving. Marcus settled back in his chair, satisfied, as though the matter had been raised and would simply wait for me to catch up. I picked up my fork. I finished my dinner. I answered the questions addressed to me and did not raise my voice and did not make a scene, because Oliver was at the table and he was 2.5 years old, and Christmas Eve was not a battlefield he needed to be present for. After dinner, while Vanessa and Patricia cleaned up and Gerald settled onto the couch with his phone, Marcus took Oliver to give him a bath. I walked to the kitchen to offer help. Patricia glanced at me and said they had it handled. I said goodnight and went down the hall to the office. I sat on the fold-out couch in the dark for a while. Then I picked up my phone and called Diane. She answered on the second ring. She always answers on the second ring. I told her about the cosign request. She went very quiet in the specific way. Diane goes quiet when she is processing something concerning. She asked me to repeat the amount Gerald had mentioned. I repeated it. She asked if Marcus had given any indication that he had already discussed this with legal counsel. I told her what Marcus had said at the table. She said, "Robert, I need you to do something for me right now. Log into the credit monitoring service we set up after your restructuring." I asked her why. She said, "Just do it." I logged in. There was an inquiry. 3 weeks old. A hard credit pull from a commercial lending institution in Illinois, tied to a guarantor application with my name, my social security number, my home address. I sat with that for a moment. Someone had already submitted the application. Not asked me first. Submitted it. Used my information, my credit, my identity, without my knowledge or my consent. The application was still pending, waiting for a signature that someone had apparently expected to obtain over Christmas dinner as a formality. I said, "Diane." She said, "I see it." I said, "How?" She said, "Marcus is listed as an authorized contact on the application. Someone provided your personal information. The application was submitted November 28th, 3 weeks ago, while I was in Westerville wrapping Christmas presents and looking forward to seeing my grandson." I sat in that dark office for a long time after I hung up the phone. I could hear the television in the living room, Gerald's voice, the occasional sound of Vanessa's laugh. Down the hall, I could hear Marcus singing something to Oliver during the bath, a song Carol used to sing, actually, a silly little thing she made up when Marcus was small. I sat there and listened to my son sing his mother's song to his son, and I thought about the version of this story where I walk down that hall and tell him what I know, and we have the conversation we should have had years ago. Then I thought about his face at that dinner table, the impatience. Gerald and Patricia are our family now. I did not go down the hall. I called Diane back. I said, "Start the process we talked about in September." There was a pause. "All of it?" "All of it." In September, after one of my visits had gone particularly badly, the one where Vanessa made a comment about Oliver's birthday party that made clear I was not expected to attend. I had sat with Diane for 2 hours, and we had talked through contingencies. Diane had drawn up a set of documents, purely as a precaution. I had signed them. I had hoped never to use them. I am a methodical person by nature, but I am also a person who prefers to be wrong about the people he loves. I was not wrong. "Give me 72 hours, Diane said. "Maybe 60. "Take what you need," I said. "I'm going home in the morning." I packed my bag before I went to sleep. I left the scarf I had brought for Vanessa on the desk, still in its gift bag with the tissue paper. I left Oliver's presents under the tree. I wrote a note on a piece of paper from the printer on the desk, just 4 words, and I folded it and wrote Marcus's name on the outside. Then I lay down on the fold-out couch and I slept, which surprises people when I tell them, but I have always been able to sleep when the hardest decision is behind me rather than ahead. In the morning, I was up before anyone. I left the note on the kitchen counter. I picked up my bag. I stopped at the living room door and looked at Oliver asleep on his little portable mattress. They had moved him out of his room so Gerald and Patricia could have the guest room, and I stood there for a moment with my hand on the door frame. "I'll see you, buddy," I said, quietly enough that he didn't stir. Then I walked out, got in my car, and drove back to Westerville. I was 50 miles down I-90 when Marcus called the first time. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let it go. Vanessa called twice. Gerald called once. I didn't even know Gerald had my number, which told me something. By the time I crossed into Indiana, it had been 11 calls in 40 minutes. The note I had left said, "I know about the application. Nothing else." 4 words. I wanted him to have to sit with those 4 words and think about every possible meaning before he called me. I wanted him to understand, without me explaining it, that I was not someone he could manage. I want to tell you what Diane did in those 60 hours, because the work she did matters, and she deserves credit for it. She filed to revoke the pending guarantor application immediately, citing unauthorized use of personally identifying information. She contacted the commercial lender directly and informed them that the application had been submitted fraudulently, that I had not authorized my information to be used, and that we reserved the right to pursue legal remedies. The lender suspended the application within 24 hours. Gerald's deal collapsed before the new year. She also executed the documents we had signed in September. The monthly transfer that had been supplementing Marcus and Vanessa's mortgage transferred through the trust under a name Marcus had never specifically connected to me was stopped. The custodial account for Oliver's college fund was moved to a new structure under Diane's sole trusteeship, ring-fenced completely from Marcus, entirely for Oliver, and only reachable when Oliver turned 22. I had already set aside enough to cover 4 years at any school in the country, plus graduate school if he wanted it. Oliver would be fine. That had always been my first concern. The holding company quietly called in a small business loan Marcus had taken out 2 years ago, a loan I had personally guaranteed through a subsidiary, again without Marcus knowing the source. It was a loan for $80,000 that Marcus had used to invest in a restaurant venture that had since closed. He had been making minimum payments. Calling in the note meant he owed the full remaining balance. That was his to deal with. I did not take Oliver's presents back. I called Marcus 4 days after I returned home, when he had left 7 more voicemails, and I was ready to be calm. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Dad, I can explain." I said, "I know what you did, Marcus. I don't need you to explain it. I need you to understand that I know exactly what you did, and I need you to understand that I knew about it before I sat down to Christmas Eve dinner, and I stayed through that dinner because of Oliver." He was quiet. I said, "I also need you to understand something about who I am, because it seems like you may have formed an inaccurate picture of that over the years." I told him about the firm. Not all of it, but enough. I told him about the restructuring, the holding company, the asset base. I told him, calmly and without drama, that the money that had been quietly supporting various aspects of his life for the last several years had come from me, and that it had stopped. He said, "How much?" I said, "That's not the important question." He was quiet again for longer this time. "The important question," I said, "is whether you submitted that application yourself, or whether someone submitted it on your behalf, with your knowledge." He said Gerald needed a guarantor. He said it was the only way to. "That's not what I asked." Another silence. Then, quietly, I knew. I sat with that. I had expected it. Expecting something doesn't make it hit any softer, but it does mean you've already decided what to do. I said, "I'm not going to pursue charges, Marcus. That's not who I am, and I don't want Oliver's father in a legal situation that follows him for the rest of his life. But I need you to hear me when I tell you that you committed fraud. You used my identity without my consent to obtain financial credit. If I had not caught it, I would have been legally liable for a commercial real estate note that had nothing to do with me. You understood what you were doing." He didn't argue. I think he had expected me to argue with him, to be emotional, to threaten, and then walk back the threat the way I might have done when he was 17. I was not 17 years old's version of his father. I was 63 years old's version. And those are different men. I said, "Oliver is my grandson, and that doesn't change. I have made arrangements for his future that he'll have access to when he's grown, and those arrangements are secure regardless of anything else. If Oliver needs to see me, I will be there. If there's something Oliver needs that you genuinely cannot provide, you can call me and I'll consider it. But I'm not writing another check that flows through you, Marcus. Not one." He said, "Dad," I said, "I'm not angry. I want you to know that. I'm not calling to punish you. I'm calling to tell you the truth, because you're my son, and I think you deserve the truth, even when you've made it harder to give you things." I paused. "Your mother would have been heartbroken. I don't say that to wound you. I say it because it's true, and because I think on some level you know it, and because the part of you that knows it is the part I still believe in." He didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear him breathing. I thought I heard something that might have been him crying, but I didn't address it. Some things are private, even between a father and a son. Eventually he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are." And I meant it, meaning it did not change anything. But it was true. I hung up and sat in my kitchen in Westerville, in the house I had bought in 2003, with the coffee going and the winter light coming through the window over the sink, and I thought about Carol again. I thought about her saying, "The most dangerous thing you can give a child is the knowledge that they don't have to try." I thought about how right she was and how hard it is to act on that knowledge when the child is right in front of you, needing things. I thought about the 10,000 small decisions that led from that hospital room in October to a dark office on Christmas Eve, and I wondered, the way any honest person wonders, whether different decisions would have led somewhere different, whether I had made him this way, or whether he had made himself this way, or whether the truth was somewhere more complicated and less comfortable than either of those options. I don't have a clean answer to that. I am not sure there is one. What I know is this. Gerald's deal fell through entirely. The commercial lender, now aware that the guarantor application had involved fraudulent use of personal information, declined to restructure the note under any terms. Gerald lost a significant portion of the capital he had already committed. I heard this from Diane, who heard it from the lender's attorney. I did not arrange that outcome. It was simply the consequence of the fraud being exposed. Consequences do not always need to be orchestrated. Sometimes you just have to stop preventing them. Marcus and Vanessa are still together, as far as I know. I do not believe their marriage is in good shape, but that is not my assessment to make. Marcus called me twice more in January, once to tell me that the called-in loan had created a serious cash flow problem, and once to ask whether there was any possibility I would reconsider. I listened both times. The first time, I told him I was sorry to hear it and that I trusted him to handle it. The second time, I told him the same thing. He has not called again about money. He calls every few weeks to update me about Oliver, which I am glad for. The calls are short and careful and not quite natural, but they are calls, and I answer them. Oliver is 3 now. His birthday was in March, and I drove to Chicago and took him to the zoo, just the two of us, while Marcus and Vanessa had a day to themselves. Oliver rode on my shoulders for part of it, which I can still physically do, though I'll admit my knees had opinions about it afterward. We stood in front of the giraffe enclosure for a long time because he could not get enough of the giraffes. He kept saying more giraffe, Grandpa, even when we were directly in front of them, which I found philosophically interesting. The desire for more of a thing, even when you already have the thing right in front of you. At lunch, he fell asleep in the stroller with half a pretzel in his hand, and I sat next to him on a bench and watched people walk past. And I thought, here is the part of the story that doesn't make it into the version people want to tell. Nobody wants to hear about a man sitting on a bench at the zoo watching his grandson sleep. They want the confrontation, the revelation, the phone call at 2 a.m, the accounts closed overnight. And those things happened. I'm not pretending they didn't. I'm not suggesting the story should be softer than it is. But this is also the story. A 3-year-old with a pretzel, asleep in the March sunlight. An old man on a bench who kept his promise. I have thought about Christmas Eve many times since then. I have thought about the moment I lay on the floor and nobody moved. I have thought about what I should have felt, rage, maybe, or something cold and decisive, and I have been honest with myself about what I actually felt, which was mostly a kind of sorrow, not for myself. Sorrow is a more complex thing than that. It was sorrow for the version of the story that was no longer possible. For the version where Marcus grows into a man I don't have to be careful around. For the version where Carol is alive and none of this had to happen the way it happened. I don't live in that version. None of us get to live in the better version of our own story. You live in the one you're in, and you make the choices the one you're in requires. Diane called me in February to tell me that Gerald had filed a complaint against the commercial lender, which was going nowhere, and that Patricia had apparently told someone in their social circle that I was a difficult man. I told Diane that was probably fair. She laughed, her short, precise laugh that means she finds something genuinely funny but has decided to ration her amusement. She told me the college fund had grown 4% in the first quarter, which was better than projected. I told her to keep doing whatever she was doing. She said she intended to. I am writing this from my kitchen in Westerville, the same kitchen where I ate breakfast the morning I drove to Chicago for Christmas, the same table where Marcus used to sit and do homework while Carol made dinner, and I sat beside him working through whatever he was stuck on, patient and unhurried, because there was nowhere I would rather have been. I am 63 years old, and I have outlived my wife, and I have been betrayed by my son, and I have a grandson who thinks giraffes are the greatest thing in the world, and the math of that life is not a math I know how to simplify. What I can tell you is that I do not regret the phone call I made on Christmas Eve. I do not regret the documents I signed with Diane in September, or the decision to stop the money, or the 4 words I wrote on that note. I do not regret any of it, because all of it was honest. And I have found, in 63 years of living, that honesty is the only thing you can always afford, regardless of your other circumstances. I regret that it was necessary. That is a different thing. If Marcus reads this someday, and perhaps he will, perhaps Oliver will find it one day and show it to him. That is the funny thing about the words you leave behind. I want him to know that when I sat on that fold-out couch on Christmas Eve and listened to him sing his mother's song to Oliver, I was not thinking about the application or the fraud or the money. I was thinking about October, 34 years ago, and the hospital room, and the promise I made. I want him to know that I have kept that promise every day since, including the days when keeping it looked nothing like what he expected it to look like. I want him to know that the silence after I said goodbye was not the end of anything that matters. Some things you cannot buy. Some things you cannot take away with a legal filing or a closed account or a piece of paper. The fact that he is my son is one of those things. The fact that I love him is one of those things. Those are not things that require him to earn them or me to perform them. They are simply true. The way the house in Westerville is true. The way Oliver's laugh is true. The way Carol was right about almost everything. I closed the door. I drove home. I kept my promise. That is the whole story.